Sometimes the real world ends up being far more bizarre than anything we could dream up. Today, I'm going to take you through 3 accounts that prove exactly that. Each one progressively more unnerving, so stick with me until the end to see just how strange things can truly become. Before we start, if you're someone who enjoys eerie, dark, and mysterious stories told in a narrative style, you're in the right place. That's what you'll find here, and we post new episodes every week. If that sounds like your kind of thing, tap the like button, subscribe, and turn on all notifications so you never miss a weekly release. Now, let's dive into today's stories. On the night of December 14th, 2024, a woman in her mid-30s named Priya was preparing for bed inside her house in Chahenkalo village, a small rural community in central India. She slipped into her pajamas, brushed her teeth, and lay down alone, waiting for her husband, 35-year-old Anand Yadav, to finish his bath and join her. As she rested there, she became increasingly aware of the intense stillness inside the home. And that silence kept bringing her back to the ache she carried for years, her deep desire to have a child, and the long struggle she and Anand had faced trying to conceive. Now, with both of them in their mid-30s, she feared time was running out. She longed for a family, but wasn't sure it would ever happen. This wasn't a sudden moment of clarity. Priya had lived with this pain for a long time. So like most evenings, she tried not to dwell on it, and instead focused on the good things, especially her strong bond with Anand. They were genuinely happy together. She was trying to hold on to that sense of gratitude when the bathroom door swung open and Anand stepped out, not dressed for bed, still in his bathrobe, and behaving oddly. Priya watched him, puzzled by the fact that he wasn't getting changed. Then she noticed his face. It was flushed a bright, alarming red. Something was clearly off. Before she could ask anything, Anand suddenly sprinted out of the bedroom, still wearing the bathrobe. Priya leapt up and ran after him, trying to understand what on earth was happening. Outside, she found him collapsed on the ground. She had no idea what could cause something like this. She rushed to him, turned him onto his back, tried shaking him. But his face remained an intense red, and he wasn't reacting at all, as if he had completely lost consciousness. Not knowing what else to do, she ran to a nearby relative's house. Family members hurried back with her, lifted the unresponsive Anand into a vehicle, and drove at full speed toward the hospital. When they arrived, Priya got out first, leaving the others with Anand, and sprinted inside to alert the staff. She told the front desk that her husband wasn't breathing, wasn't responding, and was still out in the car. Medical workers rushed out immediately, brought Anand inside, and soon Priya was following behind a crowd of doctors and nurses, pushing him on a gurney toward an exam room. Once inside, she stood back while the medical team worked around him. From Priya's position in the room, she couldn't clearly see what the medical team was doing, but she could make out the lead doctor leaning over Anand, running through different tests to provoke any reaction at all. Then, suddenly, she saw the doctor stop, pull back, and his expression change into one of unmistakable pity. He turned to Priya and told her that her husband had died. For Priya, everything had happened so abruptly that her mind couldn't process it. Instead of collapsing in grief, her first impulse was sheer disbelief. How could he possibly be gone? Anand was only 35, young, healthy, active, grounded, socially engaged. Nothing about him indicated he might die without warning, so she pressed the doctor, demanding to know what had caused it. But he had no answer. The only way to find out would be a full autopsy, because there was nothing visible to explain his death. A few days later, the hospital pathologist stood in an exam room with Anand's body laid out on the table. For him, this was routine work. He had done countless autopsies. He didn't have a solid theory, but suspected a sudden cardiac issue. He made the initial incision and examined the heart, but everything looked normal. No sign of cardiac arrest, no heart attack, nothing pointing to heart failure. Next, he inspected the lungs, another usual source of sudden death. But the lungs were perfectly normal as well. He went through each major organ in turn, looking for any clue, and found none. There was simply no physical explanation for why this man was dead. Perplexed but thorough, the pathologist kept going. When he opened Anand's throat, he jerked back in shock. In all his years of work, he had never seen anything remotely like what lay before him. In the days to come, the truth would emerge. Priya wasn't the only one tormented by their struggle to have a child. Anand, too, was crushed by the possibility that he might never become a father. Without telling his wife, he sought help, but not from licensed doctors. Instead, he went to a tantric practitioner, someone who performed occult rituals, who gave him precise instructions for a ceremony that supposedly guaranteed fertility if executed perfectly. Anand believed in the ritual. He gathered the materials, took them home, and on the night he died, while Priya waited in bed and he remained alone in the bathroom. He carried out the ritual. And that ritual is what ended his life. Following the tantric's directions, Anand had taken a live baby chick and tried to swallow it whole, believing the act would guarantee that he and Priya would finally have a child. But the chick became stuck in his throat, sealing his airway, and within minutes his body began to shut down. The chick did not survive either. One morning in late November of 1979, a 64-year-old man named John Parran was walking through a park near his home in East London, South Africa, a small coastal town. The area was a wooded strip above the shoreline, so even though he was surrounded by trees, he could easily hear the waves crashing below. Being outside like this was not typical for John. He rarely left his house. His life was extremely solitary. No close friends, no nearby family, and only occasional phone calls with a distant cousin. But that morning, he felt a strange, persistent urge to go out and walk through the park. He couldn't explain it, but he didn't fight it either. So he followed the trail, listening to the ocean through the trees. Eventually, he rounded a turn and noticed someone ahead. A young man he didn't recognize was pacing back and forth as though trying to build up the courage to face something difficult. That was John's immediate impression. The young man didn't appear dangerous, just deeply troubled, which only made John more curious. If he believed his intuition had guided him out here, maybe this was the reason. As John moved closer, he realized the young man's pacing was taking him right up to the edge of a steep cliff overlooking the beach, a drop that would be catastrophic for anyone who went over it. Suddenly, everything clicked. The young man looked like he was considering stepping off the edge. He was so consumed by whatever was happening in his mind that he barely registered John's presence. He kept walking toward the cliff, then retreating, repeating the cycle like he was wrestling with a heavy internal decision. John froze for a moment, not sure how to step in. There were other people on the trail who had also noticed what was unfolding. A small group had gathered, keeping their distance, so they wouldn't startle the young man standing near the cliff. They simply watched in silence, unsure how to intervene. John, still rooted to the spot and unable to decide on a course of action, continued watching the young man's anxious pacing. And then, in an instant, everything clicked. He became convinced that this was why he had felt compelled to leave his house that morning. He was meant to approach this stranger. So John stepped away from the onlookers and walked directly toward him. The young man kept pacing, barely registering John's presence, until John placed an arm gently around his shoulders. John looked at him and quietly said, "Let me show you how it's done." Then John walked to the cliff's edge and stepped off. The young man was paralyzed with shock. He stared as John plunged toward the beach below, the impact leaving him unable to move afterward. The scene was so horrifying that the young man instantly abandoned whatever he'd been contemplating. Whatever plan he had, he no longer wanted any part of it. Seeing the brutal reality of what he had nearly done made him realize he genuinely wanted to keep living. In a strange, emotional way, he even felt grateful. Grateful that John's drastic action had jolted him out of his despair and forced him to reconsider everything. At 1 a.m. on March 3, 1944, a young brakeman named Michel Paolo was standing in the caboose of a freight train inching its way up a mountainside in southern Italy. Michel was responsible for managing the brakes on the rear portion of the train. And on this particular night, he had to be exceptionally alert. The conditions were so hazardous, he wasn't sure they'd reach the next station at all. First, a mix of rain and snow made the tracks slick, reducing the train's grip on the steep incline. Second, the engine wasn't functioning at full strength because the railroad had been forced to burn low-quality coal. It was 1944, World War II was underway, and most of the better coal had been diverted for military use. Finally, the train was carrying far more weight than intended. It was designed to transport only a small crew and freight, yet more than 500 people were secretly riding along, adding enormous strain. With the war uprooting entire communities, many civilians tried to flee devastated regions by hiding on trains. Michelle and the rest of the crew were aware of them. They could see people packed inside the cars and even clinging to the roofs. And although protocol required them to call security and have the stowaways removed, they chose not to. They felt compassion for the people hiding on board and believed that allowing them to continue their escape was the more humane choice. But on this particular night, with rain and snow making the tracks slick, the poor quality coal weakening the engine, and the massive extra weight from the stowaways, Michelle knew that if there was ever a moment the train might fail to climb the mountain, this was it. That was why he stayed hyper-focused. If the train reached a point where it could no longer push upward for any of the reasons he feared, it would start sliding backward down the mountain. That scenario would be extremely dangerous, and it would fall on Michelle, along with the engineers up front, to apply the brakes quickly enough to stop any movement. So he kept his hand near the brake lever, watching for even the faintest sign that the train was struggling. As they began the climb, things initially seemed manageable, but Michelle, who knew this train intimately, could tell it was working far harder than usual. Ahead of them was a tunnel they needed to pass through before finishing the ascent. Michelle believed the tunnel was their best chance. The covered section would give them clean, dry tracks, allowing the engine to build momentum and use that momentum to complete the climb. He watched tensely as the train crawled toward the tunnel. If they could just reach it, he thought, the rest might be achievable. Inch by inch, they drew closer. Then he felt the front of the train slip into the tunnel, and, just as he hoped, the train began to gain a bit of speed as more of it reached the dry rails. But then, without warning, the train started slowing down again, even while continuing into the tunnel. It was late, visibility was terrible, and Michelle couldn't see what was causing the loss of power. He could only feel it. By the time the caboose, Michelle's position, reached the tunnel entrance, the train had lost so much momentum that it came to a complete stop, leaving only the very last car, the caboose, still outside. Roughly 99% of the train was inside the tunnel. Michelle and his car were the only parts still exposed. Normally, the conductor in the front car made the decisions in unusual situations. And although this wasn't an emergency yet, the train hadn't begun sliding backward, Michelle could tell something was wrong. They should never have stalled here. If anything, the tunnel should have been the point where they gathered the power to finish the climb. He had no idea what caused the stop, but his training told him to stay on guard. For all he knew, the train could begin drifting backward slowly, without anyone realizing immediately. So he kept his hand ready on the brake, prepared to act the second anything shifted. Michelle kept his hand wrapped around the brake lever, waiting for a signal from the conductor. The conductor was supposed to communicate through a series of whistle blasts, instructions that told Michelle whether to apply the brakes fully, move forward, or take some other action. But nothing came. Total silence, except for the faint idle of the locomotive somewhere far ahead. A growing sense of dread began creeping over Michelle. There was no logical reason for the train to be stopped here, and the absence of any whistle commands only made the situation feel even more suspicious. Trusting his instincts, he made a choice. Despite receiving no official signal, he left the caboose and started walking forward through the cars. He stepped into the next car, the first one fully inside the tunnel. It was pitch dark. It was 1 a.m, and although he had a flashlight, he avoided turning it on because the car was packed with sleeping stowaways. These people had already been through enough. He didn't want to disturb them. He moved quietly down the aisle. Everything looked normal. Most passengers appeared to be asleep. But as he neared the door to the following car, he became aware of a new sound, a heavy rhythmic thudding coming from somewhere outside in the darkness of the tunnel. Something was striking the rock walls or the track bed, though he couldn't tell what. Still unsure of what he was dealing with, Michel continued forward into the second car. The strange pounding continued outside. The train remained motionless. No whistles, no signals, nothing. Halfway through this car, he realized something else. It was far too quiet. Typically, each car was jammed with dozens of people resting shoulder to shoulder. There should have been soft breathing, shuffling, quiet voices. But this car felt unnaturally still. For the first time, Michel lifted his flashlight and pointed it at the floor ahead of him. Then he slowly swept the beam across the figures lying on the seats. What he saw made him drop the flashlight instantly and sprint out of the tunnel in blind panic. In the days that followed, the truth would emerge. Michel's fears about the train struggling up the mountain had been entirely justified. By the time the locomotive entered the tunnel, even though the tracks inside were dry and should have helped, the other factors were simply too overwhelming. The massive extra weight from hundreds of hidden passengers and the weakened engine burning poor-quality coal. The locomotive didn't have the power to continue the climb. It slowed, then came to a complete stop. When that happened, the crew at the front needed to respond immediately. They had to force the engine back into motion by shoveling coal into the furnace as fast as possible, building enough steam to push the train upward again. That sudden surge of power was the only way they could have continued forward. They needed to push the engine back to full strength, essentially force it beyond its limits. But to do that, they had to feed an enormous amount of coal into the furnace. And because this particular coal was so poor in quality, it burned inefficiently. Where a normal load would require only a modest amount of fuel to generate enough heat, this coal demanded several times more to create the same power. But burning that much low-grade coal created a critical danger. It released extremely high concentrations of carbon monoxide, and inside an enclosed tunnel there was nowhere for the gas to escape. Michel's caboose was the only car still outside in open air. Every other car was inside the tunnel, quickly filling with toxic fumes. Within minutes, the air inside the train became unsafe for anyone to breathe. Those heavy thudding sounds Michel had heard earlier were passengers losing consciousness, falling from seats, or collapsing against the sides of the cars. When he had walked through earlier with his flashlight, the unsettling silence finally made sense. The people inside were no longer responsive. Out of the roughly 600 people on board, both stowaways and crew, only a small number survived. The vast majority were overcome by the fumes before they even understood the danger. Thank you for staying with this story. Share your thoughts in the comments. I always pay attention to what you have to say. And if you're drawn to strange, dark, and unsettling tales, there are plenty more waiting for you. But if you want one that will pull you in immediately, start with the one right here. Until next time, make sure you resubscribed and leave a comment to let me know what you think.